My name is Stephen Berry, and this is the Stephen Inquisition. There are three simple rules on the Stephen Inquisition. Number one, I will interview anyone about anything for 1 hour. Number two, I'll give them the option of excluding those things that they don't want to discuss too. For example, my grandmother might email me and say she wants to debate whether lavender flowers are better than sunflowers, and then she might want me to not mention she's dead. And number three, it's my job to probe at what the guest is conveying and grill them to make sure the details are accurate. I'd like to thank my sponsors on Mr. Berry, patreon.com/Mr. Berry, Mr. Berry, Bruce Carley, Robert Tucker, Mike McCormick, and Mega Mike. And if you wish, you can contribute on Patreon, or you can go to one-off or recurring payments on PayPal.com at Mr. Berry, Mr. Berry NZ, or crypto.com, Mr. Berry NZ, $paystream.crypto.com. I know that that's a way more difficult way to contribute, but I know that my viewers are much more intelligent than others. Now, my guest tonight, Peter Wakeman, is a 62-year-old retired airline jet pilot. He's standing as an independent candidate in the Tauranga By-election for the second time, having finished third place in the 1993 by-election. And Peter Wakeman, welcome to the show. we almost got there, just the mute button. You've got the floor for 90 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, Peter Wakeman first ran when Winston Peters resigned in 1993, causing a by-election for Tauranga. I put my nomination in first, and the media didn't really interview me, but it was interesting campaigning when people are used to voting for Tweedledum or Tweedledee, and there was no major political party, no National Labour. So it was a free, open slather for running, and this is unusual in the sense the by-election is back in Tauranga, and I announced my name first, and the media, in my view, have got worse, the television and the radio, but it's an interesting time, and I'm offering people a choice. There's 12 candidates. I'm the last one on the list, the first one to put his hand up again. So the fact that you couldn't rely on the political parties last time, so why would you want to rely on them this time for the by-election? So I'm standing as an independent, retired airline pilot, and I can ask questions and get replies in 14 days in Parliament, whereas under the Official Information Act, it can take days and months before they finally answer your questions.
All right, well, thank you very much. Now, probably one of the leading issues in this by-election campaign is the cost of living. What is driving the cost of living? Are the supermarkets to blame? Is it the sanctions on Russia, or is it our government?
Well, if you look at the cost of living, it's the banking system. We don't live in a free market because the Reserve Bank sets the interest rates, and private banks create money to lend, roughly 98%. So if you could imagine having all these people wanting to buy houses, and when the Reserve Bank lowered interest rates, the cost of housing went up because the price is determined by how much money you can borrow and how much it costs to service it. So housing's gone up. They changed the tax system, and a lot of people came back to New Zealand, forcing the price of housing up. With regards to electricity, the Labour Party left office in about 1990, setting establishment plans. And if we can remember, National Max Bradford wanted to open the market for electricity. Then National increased the Labour GST from 10% to 12.5%. And then John Key said no more taxes, increased it to 15%. So then we have the Greens, who were in partnership with the other parties, and they want a emission trading scheme tax. So that's on our electricity bill as well. So we have all these taxes, and of course it's amplified. So every time something goes up by $100, that's an extra $15 it goes up because it's GST, and then with the power companies, it's the emissions trading scheme. And of course, Tauranga used to have Tauranga Electricity and Trustpower, and the Tauranga Council in my time, they got Infotel involved, and the regional council got half the port sold, to go to the public markets. So unlike Christchurch, they really don't have 100% ownership of assets to help reduce the rates. So it's very costly, and the cost of things is going up because the fuel goes up, and as soon as inflation goes up, everyone wants to put it up by the inflation. So our buying power is just collapsing. It's like monopoly.
So in that case, is breaking up and implementing all these recommendations by the Commerce Commission on supermarkets, is this going to make any difference to the cost of living?
Well, you have to remember that the Labour Party helped Fonterra do its merger with the other industries, and they were able to bypass the exercise. And I think it's just election year next year, and they're trying to say all sorts of things. And of course, to have food, we've got Minister of Agriculture Damien O'Connor, and they've announced near Jury the new development on great farmland. And I asked him, well, they talk about saving, farmland, but, are you going to build a big city on where the good land is? And if you don't have good land nearby a city to grow your food, you're not going to have cheap food, because the transportation costs are what puts the costs up. And of course, the New Zealand dollar has gone down. So I just think if they're really serious, they would remove GST and go to a financial transactions tax.
Okay, and I'd like to come to that shortly. The sanctions on Russia, now I can see why it might be a good look to stop trading with a country that has invaded its neighbour. However, Russia was also our third biggest source of crude oil. Has the New Zealand government just shot themselves in the foot with these sanctions?
I believe so. I believe the New Zealand government is just what President Putin described as a satellite, just doing what America wants. And Fonterra had an operation there, I understood. And can you remember Prime Minister John Key at one of the meetings trying to get a free trade deal with Russia, and Russia wasn't interested. And the idea of sanctioning people and taking their assets because they know a president sort of goes against the Bill of Rights in New Zealand. And I think government is neo-Nazi sympathisers, because they are funding neo-Nazis in Ukraine that are part of the Ukrainian government. And it's just ridiculous when the more money you give Ukraine for weapons, the more Ukrainians are going to die, because Russia has so much more strength and it's their neighbour. And as former President Obama said, Ukraine is something that Russia wants. It's nothing to do with America. So I guess if you're in the arms industry, New Zealand's a great little country. If New Zealand is funding arms to fight Russia, a nuclear power, and we're going to send policemen to Tonga, so we'll be able to fight China and Russia at the same time. And of course, with the oil, that's just going to force inflation up big time, because it goes right through the economy. That's if you can get oil, and they're running out of diesel in the US at the moment in some places.
So you've just mentioned the neo-Nazi government in the Ukraine, where the president and the prime minister are both Jewish, and I realise that there are some regiments in there which have imagery which would remind some of the old SS imagery from World War II. But is that really an example of a neo-Nazi government, given it's headed by people who would be exterminated by neo-Nazis?
Well, the people believe that the president of the Ukraine is there and his life could be in danger if he doesn't do certain things. And when the Donbass had the Minsk agreement, he went to see some of these neo-Nazi battalions because he ran on a pledge of having peace. And the neo-Nazis said, you can't tell us what to do, we do what we want. And so really, if you have Nazi battalions that do what they want, you're not really governing them, and you can understand why Russia wants to protect their Russian speakers who might have dual citizenship of Ukraine and Russia. And the West hadn't done anything about it. And Radio New Zealand and TV1, in my view, have not given good journalistic coverage, from the Russian perspective, which is a bit like the Cuban Missile Crisis. They didn't want, America didn't want missiles in Cuba, and Russia doesn't want missiles on their borders either.
Okay, we'll come back to that because I know that you want to discuss foreign relations globally. You alluded to a financial services tax earlier. I mean, what is the financial services tax exactly?
Financial transaction tax. It takes a very small amount of money on each transactions. Like in the moment in Australia, in some states, if you put money into the bank, you're taxed. If you buy and sell shares, you can be taxed. And so it's just a little bit of a clip of the ticket. So the more money you have, the more tax you will be paying. And claiming back 15% GST, for example, if you're an exporter, in my view, you're not really contributing much to the taxation in New Zealand compared to the people who have to pay, retail, who have to pay 15% purchase dollar terms on the price they buy, and they can't claim it back from a retail perspective. So the exporters might have to contribute a bit more than they are at the moment.
But when you sell shares or when you sell cryptocurrency, etc., you're liable for income tax on those profits anyway, aren't you?
No. It's like if you put money in and out of your account, you'll be paying a little bit of tax. Very, very, very small. But it's just every time you put money in and out, the tax adds up. And
okay, so if a financial transaction potentially could be defined as any time one party exchanges money with another, almost like purchasing products at the supermarket. So how are you going to define this so it's easily definable, measurable, and then taxable without becoming a mess that enriches lawyers and accountants?
Yeah, basically the law wouldn't exempt anyone from the movement of money, and so it's as simple as that.
So you'd put it on every single financial transaction in the economy?
Yes, every transaction. So if you're buying a $30 million island, for example, you'd be paying a lot more tax just for shifting the money in and out of the lawyer's accounts than someone would be.
And if you were buying a bag of potatoes from the supermarket, you'd be paying the same percentage on the sale of the bag of potatoes?
Absolutely.
Being a financial transaction?
Yes.
Okay, now, so I've only seen support for this from Mana and the Social Credit Party in New Zealand, and there may be a few other examples, but they're all tiny parties anyway with highly questionable economic ideologies. Have you got examples from other countries where this financial transaction tax has been implemented in this manner successfully?
Well, as I mentioned, Australia does have some transaction tax on banking and share transactions, just on a percentage basis, and they also have stamp duty on buying property. So it depends on what area you're talking about, whereas New Zealand has a blunt instrument of 15% GST on a new house. So every $100,000 for your new house is $15,000 in tax.
I've seen all sorts of ideas about reducing GST in particular ways. The New Nation Party wanted to reduce it to 5% on basic food, and well, go ahead and define basic food, please. I would love to see you do it. Other parties have said, "I will remove it from fruit and vegetables." And in Australia, where there is a 10% GST, the example I would give is a glazed bun in a supermarket does not attract GST. A plain bun does not attract GST. A plain bun with cream in it does attract GST. And any of those varieties in a cafe all attract GST. It's incredibly messy. So if you were going to be looking at implementing this financial transactions tax, would it be the same flat amount on every form of transaction in order?
It would be, but where it would be difficult to collect is if people go to a market and they pay cash.
I guess, which is currently the case with GST as well.
Yes. So, of course, the government has had, through the Reserve Bank, has had lots of inquiries about whether we should get rid of cash. And of course, we had that exercise in Canada where some people supporting the truckers had their bank account seized. So if you don't have cash and you get debanked by the government, you're in big trouble without being able to be financially transact and have your money seized.
No, absolutely. So in terms of the functions of the Reserve Bank, so money tourism, swept the world in the 1980s following the stagflation of the 70s, which resulted from out of control government spending. The oil crisis was part of this, but certainly not the sole cause of it. And the correction resulted in double-digit inflation rates across the world. But the correction eventually worked, and we did have a stable money with relatively stable inflation, especially since the 1990s. It was a bit tougher in the 80s, I recognise. But prior to this Labour government, the function of the Reserve Bank was only to control inflation. Now Grant Robertson's also tasked it with controlling unemployment as well as inflation. Is this symptomatic of the problem, or is the monetarist policy on its own the issue?
Well, I think the finance minister really is the minister of Kiwi departures, because if you don't have sufficient funds to get through each week, like the price of fuel, I've heard some people can't get to work because they can't afford the price of fuel because they're that close. And in America, if some people don't even have $500 in the event of unforeseen expenditure. So I personally think the Reserve Bank took interest rates too low, causing the property market to balloon. And the fact that they spent so much money on COVID compared to not spending money now, because councils are unsustainable with the rates increases and their requirements. I think the government really has to make climate change financially viable by using debt-free money and other things like infrastructure rather than taxing the hell out of everybody, which they are at the moment. And and we don't have the tourists coming in, because every time you go shopping, 15% GST is taken out of circulation. So we have a problem with that. And the government, creating debt-free money during the pandemic did sort of cover some of that. But I just think people do not have enough money to get through at the moment. And the wages really need to be about $30 an hour, because people can't get workers because they can't afford to live in the housing, say Wellington, for example, because it's too expensive. So we really have our costs are too high and the income too low. And the government really needs to correct that. But the government is subsidising landlords and collecting 15% GST on new housing. So really, I think the government's policy is well out of whack of looking after the New Zealanders, that you want them to stay in New Zealand rather than go to the departure lounge to leave New Zealand.
So should the Reserve Bank maintain its focus on inflation only, as it did quite successfully up until Grant Robertson changed the rules a few years ago?
Well, if you look at the Reserve Bank, we've depreciated against the US dollar. We've increased, the fuel prices increased significantly. We've got supply chain issues. And Turkey has 73% inflation or thereabouts. And the President Erdogan says, if you put interest rates up too high, you'll wreck the economy. So it's a difficult tightrope, and I really don't see the Reserve Bank having much influence on unless you raise interest rates to raise the currency, because 70% of our costs are offshore. And, we're just a passenger. And I can remember the first Labor government devalued the New Zealand dollar by 25% when 70% of our costs were offshore. And of course, that increased inflation. So I just don't think many people think things through when they have such a one-eyed policy, because common sense isn't allowed, because everyone's got their own little area of expertise. So I think the Reserve Bank really is a passenger. These central banks seem to be talking to one another, and you do this, I'll do that. And if you look at the Japanese central bank, their currency has depreciated quite significantly, and they talk about, since this exercise of Russia is now creating their own money rather than going to a New York Federal Reserve borrowing money or offshore. They can do it sufficiently. And New Zealand really, in my view, for a long time has been going to the Federal Reserve, which is private bankers, to borrow money from them to balance the books. And I don't know if you followed the work of Steve Keen, but he believes you've got to look at the money creation from the private banks as well as the government. And if the government continually operates a surplus, that actually takes money out of the system, and the country is in trouble.
Yeah, well, I mean, the issue of creating money from private banks through lending at interest actually creates a value, because the person receiving it will use it for building a residential property or for building a business, etc. But the way that the Reserve Bank money's been borrowed has essentially just been splashed across the economy to boost spending at a time where there's now too much money for too few goods.
Well,
and you mentioned increasing wages up to $30 an hour. Surely you couldn't do that with a government diktat, because that would just worsen inflation.
Well, the thing is that we do have to increase the disposable income, and because of rising costs. And the banks actually like inflation, because that gives people more equity in their house when house prices go up. And New Zealand's really been an economy where money has been borrowed to keep the house prices going up. And if you're in a trouble with, say, a credit card, you're paying, 18%. But if you are someone like a billionaire, you can buy US dollars or other currencies at very low interest rates. So we really have financial apartheid. If you only can get, payday lenders or anything like that, your interest rate is not good value for money compared to other people. So for the have-nots, it's not looking good, and the haves have always done a lot better.
Now, despite COVID and the issues with the cost of living, economic growth is still reasonably strong. But isn't this really just inflation fueled? And do we perhaps need to have a recession in order to recover properly and balance the issues with costs of living?
I guess
we can't keep on just spending government money to try and prevent the economic crash. It's got to come, doesn't it?
Well, we've got a shortage of housing, and that, because of housing, that actually creates a lot of jobs, and the supply chain issues is, really driving the costs of that, which are increasing rapidly. So, and the old story is, if you have a big crash, you then can have a recovery, but if you keep on extending the bubble, eventually it will pop. So I personally think the whole thing is being caused by central banks taking interest rates down too low, because normally with around about 7% used to be about the magic number to help depositors and help borrowers. So when you reduce the interest rate, you need less debt servicing costs, which forces the price of the property you're going to buy up. And if it goes up very high, the price of the property comes down. So I just think the government is really a passenger for what they're doing, and they did want to spend extra money when COVID was around on projects. And if you don't do anything yourself and you put it out for tender, and there's a work shortage, the prices are only going to go up big time because we haven't got enough workers.
Okay, now I'm going to move on to some specific projects for Tauranga shortly. You've run in a number of by-elections. If correct me if I miss any. So it's Tauranga in 1993, one of the Mount Albert ones, one of the one in Te Tai Hauraro, which you can probably pronounce better than I can, but generally haven't attracted a lot of votes in those. So is there an ulterior purpose for standing, or is this by-election going to be the one where Peter Wakeman actually shakes things up and attracts a competitive number of votes for the future?
Well, the thing is that I think when I ran last for mayor in Tauranga, I called it the apathetic paradise of New Zealand. And a lot of people like the climate and they don't really pay attention to voting. And a general election, it takes 2 ticks to vote, and in a by-election, it's one person. And a lot of people don't see it as an opportunity to put the Tweedledum and Tweedledee on notice by voting for someone else. And that's the most important thing you do, because if you are in a big party, your strength is not that great. Whereas if you're a coalition partner, you can get the big party to do certain things, so you will go with them to form a government. So I just think a lot of people don't realise the power of their vote. They just have been, in my view, conditioned. Instead of a pandemic vaccination, they've had a media sort of not an attractive empowerment sort of commentary to empower them to have a real look at what they can do during by-elections. And unfortunately, many people don't pay attention, and especially when they're stressed, cost of living, they say, oh, I can't be bothered. But if you look at Ukraine, that's what happens to a country that gets out of whack. You're at war, all people are leaving, and you've got big troubles. And I would suggest that New Zealand is looking at very serious problems around the corner.
You were going to stand in the Northcote by-election in 2018. I think that's where we first met at an event during that. But you withdrew and you put your support behind social credit candidate Tricia Cheal, who, if I may be blunt for a moment, is probably battier than Batman doing a bat shit in the Bat Cave. Do you regret putting your support behind Tricia?
Well, she's been a community worker for many years. She's been against 1080. I still keep in touch with her. I've known her for quite some time, and I think she's very passionate. And she sort of suggested to me that she's over trying to help people because they really don't give much. Not all of them, but some of them don't really, want to follow what's going on. So she's finds it quite challenging to.
Oh yeah, she stopped talking to me since I gave her a 5 clown rating in the last Auckland mayoral elections, but I guess that was inevitable. So moving on to Tauranga, I mean, everybody's got pork barreling in a by-election. Everybody does. I mean, God, I was going to build a $5 billion motorway in the Northcote by-election, but people got angry because it was going to go through their parks, and I was trying to avoid knocking down their houses. But what do you think the infrastructure issues are in Tauranga, and what would you prioritise?
Well, at the moment, the rail is just about at capacity for the port, and they're suggesting it needs to double to increase its capacity. I personally am not talking about any big projects. A lot of people do not want commissioners, they want councillors, and at the end of the day, an MP can say all sorts of things, but the law is commissioners or councillors, and unless the council has money to do things, it's not going to happen. And the way council rates are going, right around the country, is just ridiculous. Like they want to do a stadium, and the cost today might be X, and long term it might go up big time. And I've paid croquet at the croquet club that land would have to be given up. So I just don't like the idea of adding to traffic and building all these big infrastructures when these days television can take you to a match or whatever sporting venue it is. I just don't think we need these big white elephants around the place. I think we need more areas that, like kids, for example, can play football, and having big green spaces for everyone to use rather than the big professional players, which seem to be supported by the taxpayer or the council in many incidents.
Yeah, I would agree. There's countless examples of stadium being approved by councils, which take years to get final approval and final design, etc., and then the cost blows out, and then it takes too long to build as well. Some examples in Tauranga at the moment: $1 million just consulting on the drainage of a park. Elizabeth Street's under construction. Wasted $7 million beautifying it, and nobody's happy with it. And yet the mayor wants to put up rates by about 13% because the council's completely blown its books doing this. But you do have some preferences in terms of Tauranga Airport, I understand.
Well, when I was submitting to the annual plan and the district plan, they looked at getting rid of the airport, and they didn't realise because it was acquired under the Public Works Act, it would have to be returned to the former owners. And at the end of the day, they decided to keep it, fortunately. And because I did some gliding at the gliding club in Tauranga, and I do like airports quite close to where you want to go, because they looked at shifting the airport to a different location, and it's shifting infrastructure from one place to another is absolute nightmare, and it'd be a big traffic jam, driving 45 minutes to a different location to catch a plane. So I think they're very lucky to have an airport so close to the city, and I like flying in and out sometimes, and driving, I don't like driving much. I'd sooner fly.
And Tauranga Port is probably on its way to becoming the most important port that we have in New Zealand, especially with the issues at the Auckland port, and God knows how long it's going to live there, or whether it's going to get moved to Northland or whatever. What about the infrastructure issues around the Tauranga port? You mentioned rail earlier.
Yes, well, it's the limit. They believe it's around about at full capacity on the train line, so it's only one way operation on the train, and so to actually put in another line would be very complicated. And then of course, who's going to pay for it? And you've got all these competing interests, for the taxpayer or the council or the port, and the discussion can go on forever. But if you lived in China, they decide what they're going to do and they do it.
Yeah, and if you're in the way, they just build around you,
or take your house away without any compensation. Yes.
Now, Three Waters is also the other big issue in Tauranga, and it is nationally. Of course, the voters in Tauranga are kind of don't really have a voice on it at the moment because the council is being run by a commissioner. Do you support amalgamating Three Waters into 4 nationwide bodies?
Not at all. I asked the finance minister, what is his finance model for Three Waters, and if they can create all that money for COVID, why can't they create it for Three Waters? And the more bureaucracy that you add, it just gets so complicated. And
there are councils that have done water well, but there are also just as many examples of councils, especially those with low population densities, that haven't invested into the infrastructure, and now they're facing issues. Even Wellington is having problems with sewerage, and they've made steps towards amalgamating 10 councils' water infrastructure into one. So, if the government went ahead with Three Waters, surely that might be the only solution for some of these councils with such low population density.
Well, I don't think there's anything, as you just mentioned, they can do that without Three Waters. And why not? But to have one size fits all, I just think is ridiculous. And, if you look at how, local councils used to own their own lines companies, and the electricity was all owned by the taxpayer. The telecom was owned, by the taxpayer. And then when it was sold off, they then give money to these private entities to upgrade to fibre. So it's socialising the losses and privatising the profits. And that's, no accountability. And I just see the costs going up, and the costs are already high. And as I say, cost of living. And I just think this Prime Minister and the Finance Minister are way off common sense, because the amount of bureaucracy they're creating for all the things they want to do, in my view, is increasing the bureaucracy and reducing the delivery.
Though surely you wouldn't be suggesting that we go back to a time where these basic infrastructures were fully state-owned, given what an absolute bureaucratic mess they were. I mean, waiting for a phone line for 6 weeks is a pretty easy example. The amount of losses on railways nationwide because they simply just lost your products. Cases where they thought they'd lost a truck off one of the tracks down into the water, and there were 4 others down there. Every single one of these state-owned prior to becoming state-owned enterprises and then prior to being sold off, were a disaster. You wouldn't be suggesting that we return to that, would you?
Well, if you look at British Airways, they made a profit after they were privatised because they got rid of their debt. And if you look at the price that they got for New Zealand Rail, was not very high. And then all the subsidies that they wanted to get from the taxpayer, they decided to get it. And when it was sold, or before it was sold off, they wanted to separate the ferries from the rail. So, the government really is the cheapest operator, for doing, healthcare, for example, because we don't have to pay an insurance company and everything else like that. The US, when you look at their health costs, and they don't have ACC, if you're in business, you have to have big liability insurances and everything else like that. And the costs are too high, and that's probably why manufacturing has left the US. And, the whole reason for the ACC is to keep costs down, so your car insurance isn't exorbitant. Because in America, as you know, if you're a tourist, you need lots of insurance. So imagine being an employer there for all the insurance that you would have to pay to operate your business. So, so to say one is good and one is bad, it's not quite right in my view. It depends on the situation.
Currently, the government spends about $17 billion on the education system, and that's with students paying 25% of course costs for tertiary education, etc. And I understand that you would like to see education free across the board. Given that we're currently spending $17 billion out of $110 billion on the system we have now, how could it be affordable to move to absolute free education in the future? And what would you cut? Would you cut spending elsewhere, or would you increase taxes?
Well, for a start, the education for getting qualification has to start at school, because I believe the school system is not motivating people to learn trades and leave without debt for the workforce waiting them. So in my view, the education system needs a big heave-ho. And so people at school, like there are people who've worked in private enterprise, and they've gone to school and they've actually found that, some of the most enjoyable work that they've ever done. And I think with these technologies, we've actually got to reduce the cost of education. It's just too high at the moment. And I don't think all the bureaucracy around it is giving good value for money. Like if it costs so much to be a dentist, surely we could reduce the costs and hire more people to be dentists. Same with doctors. It seems to be a toll gate
But you're talking about reducing cost. Is this reducing cost to the student, or is it reducing the cost of the education? Because if you're reducing the cost to the student, it's just costing the taxpayer more, isn't it?
Well, I think we've got to reduce the cost to both. And that's why I'm saying it's got to be free, like nursing and all that used to be no student loan required. You go to a hospital and you would start learning and you would do some exams and courses, and it wouldn't cost as much as it does now. Same with apprenticeships. The bureaucracy for education, in my view, it's just turned into a big toll gate. And I just think it has to encourage, as I say, young people to be able to learn at school. Like in, for example, Italy, you can leave school as a qualified chef. What's wrong with that? With low debt, and you can go straight into work. And we've got to give kids the idea that they, if they're passionate about something and they want to do it, like nursing, whatever, cooking, it's possible. But if they want to be a rocket scientist or something like that, that's a sort of a more specialized course. But there are some people who do homeschooling, and that they actually advance faster than the ones who go to school regularly because they're more productive in time.
If you're on partnership schools, would partnership schools a step in the right direction, even though they didn't really get a chance to grow as much as should have been?
Well, for the cost per student, their costs were a lot higher.
Though they were that also was a result of needing to purchase grounds, etc., whereas the public schools cost per student didn't have that issue. Yes,
well, the thing about schools is, I know the ACT Party would like to give people vouchers and they all choose, but sometimes that's impossible. And that's why there are school zones. And if you're not in the school zone, your child can't get into that school. But I think we do need to incentivize better training, and parents, in my view, are the roadblock in many cases because they just believe that the school system can do it all and they don't have to help their child read and write and do their homework because they're so stressed. And some parents I've heard sending their child to private schools are doing their homework and they get a letter from the school saying, could parents please refrain from doing their child's homework because there seems to be a different standard at school compared to what happens with their homework. So
surely if maybe there was a voucher system or ACT's had a couple of other ideas, and we all know my prejudices, but I'm not representing the ACT Party here. But if students go from being an expense to becoming a source of income, then surely the need for school zoning disappears, and these kids that are trapped in zones in poor South Auckland schools suddenly have a much greater opportunity than they previously would have.
Well, I think the school system is quite challenged with what they have to put up with, and they're glorified social workers in many cases with what's happening. I just think it's we've got big problems out there, and we need to address them with truancy and everything else like that. And if parents are on P and their child's not turning up to school, that's not a really satisfactory outcome for the child if they want to get ahead.
And perhaps looking at the other end of the education system, tertiary education, with the glorification of going to university so you can get a Bachelor of Arts in Gender Studies and all the other social justice crap that they have these days. I tell you what, I used to get laughs at university making gender studies jokes in 2014. By 2018, nobody was laughing. They were vicious. I've never gone to university. I shudder to think what actually goes on in there. But have universities become the thing that we insist our children must join right up until they become adults, and then they just waste years and money borrowing loans to pay for education that's actually crap?
Well, some people don't know what they want to do, and that's very difficult, especially if they go to university when they don't know what they want to do.
Mm.
I
The 1 year free training that the 1 year free university that Labor introduced, keep it, extend it, or scrap it?
well, most people think it should be on the last year because they're already committed. But some people weren't going to go to university because that was the carrot to go there and then they got in the habit. Then of course students don't get benefits, student allowances, so they have to have holidays and they get the minimum wage during midterm holidays, if you like, and they're back in the real world. So no, I think if you give things and suddenly take them away, people think it's unfair. It's just like KiwiSaver when you used to get something to join and now you don't. So I say, well, you got that and we didn't. It's just like home ownership funds years ago for helping people buy houses or farms at 5%, and the government helped you into a home, and they don't do that now in the same sense. So I think education really, in my view, is one that needs something to happen to it, especially at the school system, because I just think the administration to actually improve the outcomes for people at school, in my view, is an urgent need.
And probably given that there's now more bureaucrats in the education public service than there is number of schools in New Zealand.
Yes, exactly. I heard someone, for example, they were dealing with special needs kids, and the allegation was that the Education Review Office said that you actually have to show through the education system that you're improving the kids, and they had to say to them, well, these are special needs. Most of them, don't actually improve. So, and the comment that the checkers, if you like, on the system, years ago, I think the checkers were experienced people and could add to the quality of the expertise of the people they were, auditing. And these days, it's just crossing their I's and just dotting everything here and there. And I just think the practicalities of things have just gone out the window.
Now, the voting system for New Zealand, you've been talking about this for at least as long as you've been running in by-elections. So I believe you're an advocate for STV. And for those who think that's something you get when you don't wear a condom, that's a single transferable voting system. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it has been in health board elections up and down the country. And the odd council has it in there, I think Wellington and Dunedin for local bodies. And I just think that was good to have competition and encouraging people to vote, whereas first past the post is a pretty tall order to get the most under first past the post. But we have the party system at the moment under MMP, whereas if your leader wants you and your party wants you, you don't have to face the electorate, you're in the system. Whereas if you're in Ireland and you're a finance minister and you do a very unpopular budget or what happens, the people can vote for other members of the party, but not you. Mm-hmm. So the accountability I like, and unfortunately New Zealanders normally vote for the same people and complain afterwards, but it's the New Zealanders who vote for people. If they tell porkies and they hire them again, they shouldn't point the finger at someone else. They should look at the other fingers pointing at them, because at the end of the day, it's the Kiwis who decide who get into Parliament, no one else.
If we had an STV system, would it finally be time to scrap the Māori seats?
I do believe they have a role, and I would like the STV system to be for the candidate vote. So for the electorate.
That's all it would be for, wouldn't it? You would have
yes.
multiple candidates within each electorate?
Yes, exactly. And the standard of candidate, in my view, these days, with a lot of parties just saying we're going for the party vote, because New Zealanders really haven't sort of gone for the candidate vote for the electorate. It's very sad, unfortunately.
No, it's still very much the old two-party system with electorates. Now, COVID-19, we look back now and the government response has probably been nothing short of disastrous. I think I gave them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, having not lived through the Spanish flu, that perhaps they were doing the right thing initially by locking down the country. But have they done the right thing? Have they failed to learn from what's happened in the rest of the world? What would you say?
Well, this book, The Real Anthony Fauci, I think that sort of looks at what happens with regards to having vested interests who lobby for certain outcomes, and has the outcome that we've got from COVID response really been about helping people avoid it? And my view has always been that vitamin D, and I learned this before COVID from someone who works in the hospital system, saying that you have 30% less chance of getting depressed and your immune system improves by approximately 30% if you have a certain level of vitamin D. And what we find with COVID is that the people with low vitamin D are more likely to get COVID. And this has not been mentioned.
Is this just one factor out of many in terms of obesity or poor diet, age?
Yeah, well, it seems to be a regular factor, according to lots of data, and they don't really collect data. I find the whole system of people being responsible for their health based on what they see in the media is not really the ideal solution. And like I would like to have seen hospital messages, just drink water, because a lot of people go to hospital because they drink tea or coffee and they forget to drink water and they're dehydrated and they clog up the hospital system. I just think people...
North Korea is actually recommending to their citizens now that they drink 2 litres of warm water a day to ward off COVID. But
yeah, well, that would probably help with your throat, because I ended up in hospital with a throat infection, and I drank lots of water. And they said, "Oh, you shouldn't have anything." I said, "No, I do need to drink water," and because they put nil by mouth, and then I said, "I'm getting better now. I don't need all these steroids." "Oh, no, you have to have them. It's on the system." "But I'm getting better." "Oh, no, you have to have them now." I said, "Please." But no.
Are you double jabbed?
No.
No. And have you caught COVID, if you don't mind me asking?
I haven't had COVID, no.
No, I got double jabbed, and I've still never caught it. I'm not getting the triple jab. How difficult has that made it to function in New Zealand in the last 12 months with the with the vaccine mandates?
Well, I have membership in bridge clubs, and these are ladies who have been terrified of not all of them, and they want to keep the mandates going because they believe if they're vaccinated, they've got less chance. They haven't read some of the reports that say that after a period of time, the effectiveness of the vaccine wanes, and other reports alleging that if you've been jabbed 3 times or whatever, you could be more likely to get COVID than the ones who haven't been jabbed. And as I say, the vitamin D aspect is the one that I've been using. And in this by-election, I've heard of 2 other candidates that have had COVID. And one other candidate, I don't know if she had COVID or not, but she said that she was sick for a week. And then there's lots of tummy bugs going around with fevers, and they're saying that with people being locked up, their immune system is not as strong as it used to be because it's sort of been on holiday, not socializing with everyone. So there's lots of arguments for which scientific and peer-reviewed study you want to read, but sunlight and exercise and diet. I think Sue Ketley said 90% of what's wrong with you or right with you is to do with your diet.
Well, maybe I was lucky to be working in supermarkets for most of that period, and I always thought so because I didn't have to worry about an income, but maybe it kept my immunity up as well.
Yes, well, probably, exactly.
Now, we did touch on some foreign policy stuff in terms of Russia and the Ukraine before. But I guess that's just one small part of a much bigger picture now in terms of the aggression of China in the South Pacific. And it seems that New Zealand's not really doing a lot to address it. But we also have to keep in mind that we've actually got a balance of trade surplus with China. I think it's about $4 billion off the top of my head. We send out far more milk powder and the like than they send us back in machinery. I don't know how much $2 t-shirts they send us, but there is a trade surplus there. How can we deal with China's aggression when we are so financially dependent upon them?
Well, you only have to look at the political parties, and you'll find that the Chinese embassy has representatives at their party conferences. And I believe that, I don't know, I haven't heard that it's not happening, but they would just observe National and Labour Party conferences. You've had National and Labour people leave and have certain positions, and some of them might have included on a Chinese bank, for example. Then you've had other members of parliament in both those parties, and some of those people are not in parliament anymore. And then, of course, you've had land that's been able to, Chinese interests have been able to buy land in New Zealand, but we haven't been able to do the same thing in China. And of course, if you look at Tonga with issuing Chinese passports and Fiji with respect to giving their fishing rights, I think the boat's already left.
Do we currently give about $1 billion in foreign aid to Pacific nations now? Should we be increasing that? Should we be increasing our defence spending to 2% of GDP in response to the threat of China?
I don't believe we can rely on anyone to look after New Zealand, and I don't think we get any value for money for our 2% increase in defence spending. I think the military equipment that we have, for patrolling such large areas of maritime control and having 737s and all that sort of stuff is very onerous on the taxpayer. And I just, with Russians' hypersonic weapons, the American aircraft carriers, you don't need them, because they'll just be targets with these hypersonic missiles and they'll be destroyed. And if you're a submarine, well, I don't know, there might be some use for submarines if you're undetected, but there's lots of areas where they can be detected. And of course, Russia during the Cold War, they talked about that Russia was able to read the American code. So I just think our defence really needs to be within, New Zealand, and I would like to see, with people who do P and all that sort of stuff, I think we need home defence rather than buying all these frigates and aircraft and all that sort of carry on. I think we've got to look after ourselves, because if you look at Auckland, it looks very dangerous and continuing down that trajectory where people don't feel so safe.
And we've got less than 2 minutes left. Jacinda Ardern's been over in America trumpeting her success in gun control. Meanwhile, the gun buyback in 2019 seems to have fueled gang violence in New Zealand, and they're not doing it with guns they bought from the gun shop. Do we need to re-liberalise gun laws, or is it just a matter of holding parents responsible or funding the police, or how do we fix this?
Yes, well, I've heard people who are selling guns, people who don't have gun license want to buy them, and they say, well, sorry, I can't sell them to you because you haven't got a gun license. So when there's a market, it doesn't matter whether you have laws or don't have laws, it's a market. And if you look at Ukraine, all these weapons that, might be, you can find them for sale at the moment, and they fall in the wrong hands, we're in big trouble. So I don't think laws can, guarantee anything, and that the best way to have a society functioning is people having enough food so they don't have to turn to crime if they have food and shelter.
So if we liberalise gun laws, would we be accepting that the market's going to exist whether we try to prohibit it or not, and at least give those who wish to use them lawfully, the right to participate.
Yes, well, America believes that their citizens need guns in the case that the politicians don't do things, or their police force gets out of control, and that's part of their rationale for having weapons.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we have come to the end of the 1 hour. Peter Wakeman, thank you for participating in the Stephen Inquisition. Good night.
Thank you, Steve. Good night.